All right, hello everybody, and welcome to this Skill Me Up CloudMaker Expert Talk on Microsoft 365 Information Governance and Retention Policies. My name is Dwayne Natwick. I am a Cloud Training Architect lead at Skill Me Up and Opsagility, where I author content and provide live and on-demand training. I'm also a Microsoft Certified Trainer and a Regional Lead for that program, and as well as a Microsoft Azure MVP. And you can reach me on the social media links provided on the slide.
And my name's Cleary. I run my own consulting firm. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, as well as a Microsoft Certified Trainer. I focus heavily on the Microsoft 365 platform and security. And of course, feel free to reach out to me on my social media links too.
All right, so today we're going to talk about some good things around information governance and retention policies, and what is important about information governance, how we can utilize retention policies to manage and accomplish our governance of information, and then how do we monitor and protect that information utilizing the information governance within Microsoft 365. So let's start off by talking about what exactly is information governance and how do we attain that, and what things go into information governance. So information governance is really two primary parts. There's the information governance, and then there's the records management piece of things. What information governance does is it manages the risk and liability of your information, and how information is then handled, whether it's how long it's retained, how it's handled in terms of whether it's deleted once it meets a certain time frame. For example, in the United States, if for tax purposes you're supposed to retain your records for 7 years, you could set up a retention policy that will manage that information and remove it after 7 years and make sure it's held on to for that 7 years. It can also allow for managing Exchange Online mailboxes to retain and search email messages for potential compliance and regulatory reasons or legal reasons within the organization, and retain that information even once the user of that email box may no longer be with the company, and as well as importing and archiving and applying different solutions with third-party data from social media platforms, instant messaging, as well as Teams platforms and document collaboration platforms. So all of those things go into that information governance piece. And then the second piece of that is that records management. Records management provides how the high-level content is being used with specialized workflows, meeting those legal and business and regulatory record keeping requirements, and providing then a single solution in how email and documents incorporate those retention schedules and those governance schedules for a life cycle of your data. So Liam, why don't you take the next section here and talk about what do retention policies help to accomplish?
Okay, perfect. So retention policies can help us to achieve specific things. So there's only really a few of them. I mean, obviously, of course, they can be used for all kinds of different things. But our first one is, as Dwayne had said, to comply with kind of industry regulations. So for example, you might have to comply with Sarbanes-Oxley, or you might have to keep your tax records for a certain amount of time. It also helps you reduce the risk if there's a litigation or a security breach. Now, this one's quite interesting because I've worked with lots of organizations where they don't understand how beneficial it is to not have lots of information lying around in the event of a litigation or a breach. And then, of course, lastly, it helps the organization to share the knowledge effectively and for you to be more agile with the users and their content. So the retention is all about this ending piece of a document lifecycle, so that we create the content, we work on it, collaborate, and then we ultimately end up destroying or removing that content. Now, I suppose the next question that comes into play would be, where can we actually apply the policies? So the good news is that in Microsoft 365, our first and primary place has always been Exchange email. That's actually where retention policies were first created. They didn't exist anywhere else but Exchange email address and email boxes. Next, it kind of been added to SharePoint sites, OneDrive sites, Microsoft 365 groups, which is actually the 3 previous combined together. Then, of course, Skype for Business, if you're still using that, Yammer, private messages and community messages, as well as Teams chats and messages and Exchange public folders. These are all locations that are available for utilizing retention policies. Now, they are different, and the effect that it has on the information is different in each place. But you can apply a single or a multiple policy to the single locations or the multiple locations, or even include and exclude locations and users. So what are the locations that are available? Well, if we're utilizing SharePoint and OneDrive, which is kind of the most common, then a copy of what we want to keep is stored within what's called a preservation hold library. This is a core location where we apply a policy to it and it gets dropped into kind of this library for storage. If we're utilizing Microsoft Exchange mailboxes, then there is a recoverable items folder that's inside those mailboxes, and that's where those items get stored. Now, for Teams and Yammer, they have the most weirdest name folder called Substrate Holds. I don't know why they couldn't come up with a different name, but Substrate Holds works for me. And it's a subfolder in the Exchange recoverable items folder. So really, they could have just said it's in the recoverable items folder, but they had to give it a different name. So 3 different core locations of where retention or stored documents and content is retained. So what does that look like when it gets into SharePoint and OneDrive then? So firstly, let's say we start with a document library. Okay, so we have the document library, and then there's a couple of actions that we can go through. So first off, let's say that if the content has been modified or deleted. So if we look at the bottom flow here, you can see that if the content is modified or deleted, for example, during a retention period, a copy of that content as it existed when the retention policy was assigned is then created and dropped into the preservation hold library. We also can see that we've got first stage and second stage recycle bins within SharePoint and OneDrive. So if an end user goes in and deletes a file, it goes to the first stage, which we all know we can get back as an individual user. And then the second stage is a site collection administration function. But we have a default retention period of 93 days. That will span the first and second stage recycle bin. So at the end of the 93 days, the document is permanently deleted from wherever it resides, whether it's first or second, or if it's been moved. So when we edit documents or delete documents, we have kind of a different flow, but ultimately the end of it is it gets destroyed. That's the key to a retention policy. Now, when we're utilizing Microsoft Exchange, it's a little bit different. So in Exchange, it kind of looks similar, but we end up with emails in public folders, for example. And then, of course, we have the same kind of syntax here. So if it's going to be modified or deleted or permanently deleted, then it's going to do something. So for example, remember, permanently deleted is the shift delete option, or you get rid of it from the deleted items. So if someone deletes permanently, shift deletes or deletes from deleted items during a retention period, the item is then moved automatically to that recoverable items folder. So permanent deletion, recoverable items, and it goes there. Once it's there, there's a process that will run periodically and identify all those items whose retention period has expired, and then these get automatically deleted within 14 days of the end of the retention period. So if we think about this, if I apply a 7-year retention policy, they will get deleted 7 years and 14 days. They will be deleted. However, you can change that to be longer, so it can be 30 days, for example. Now, if an item isn't modified or deleted during that retention period, then that same process will run periodically across all the mailboxes, and it will identify the items whose retention period has expired and then just naturally delete them. So kind of similar to the way SharePoint and OneDrive work, it's all about whether you're making adjustments or changes to the content during the retention process. Now, Microsoft Teams, on the other hand, is only about storing chats and channel messages. So we have to remember that the construct of a team, you have retention that would apply on SharePoint and OneDrive, which is behind the scenes of a team. And the retention and exchange is retention and exchange that's behind a Microsoft team also. But if you want to manage those channel messages and teams, then of course, if a chat or channel message is modified or deleted during a retention period, then the message gets copied to that substrate holds folder, which is that subfolder. It's a hidden folder that you can't really see, but trust me, it's there. And it's stored in this folder until that retention period expires. So if you have a 7-year, a 30-day, a 90-day, I know I worked with an organization recently where they do a 90-day retention on chat and channel messages, and then they destroy them. So 90 days would pass, and then it would permanently delete them. So if the chat or channel message isn't deleted during that retention period, the message is moved into that same substrate holds folder within a day after the retention period expires, and then it will then be deleted a day after that, and then kept for however long we need to, or destroyed. So retention works kind of similar in all three scenarios, but there are some kind of nuances about how that flows into which location and how long it actually stays for. So how about you tell us about retention policies and how they can protect the organization, Dwayne? You're on mute.
Thank you. So retention policies do help protect the organization in multiple ways. They, as Liam pointed out, you have different retention parameters that you put in place for different services within the Microsoft 365 ecosystem, and it then helps with those retentions and how you're retaining that information, how you're handling that information from the point of somebody making the decision to delete that information, but then making sure that that information is held as long as it needs to for compliance, and whether it's organizational or regulatory within your organization, to avoid any legal tax implications or potential litigation based on a lawsuit, and being able to recover that information without it being a detriment to your organization. It also allows for information to not be held beyond where it needs to, and allows for a consistent policy and procedure within your organization in destroying that information. A lot of companies, in terms of when they were dealing with paper documents, would have to go through annually and purge their file cabinets. And this is doing that in more of a automated manner for electronic documentation, and avoids the burden on the organization, on people on the organization, to mistakenly delete something they're not supposed to delete, or holding on to something longer than they need to, or deleting something that maybe was created 7 years ago but had been modified, and there's policies in place that once it's modified, it starts that time frame. And retention policies within the Microsoft 365 system and services will keep track of that automatically for you. So how does that work, and how is that effectively managed and governed within your organization? What do you need to do from a standpoint of an organization to manage that retention and comply with that retention? So within the organization, you have need to understand what your compliances are, and what you need to understand from an industry regulation standpoint, a governmental regulation standpoint, as well as your internal policies within your organization. And for example, and I think Liam brought up Sarbanes-Oxley, for example, or if you were, like I mentioned from a United States tax purposes, having 7-year retention, Sarbanes-Oxley having retention policies and having audit trails on information that is being done within your accounting department. Keeping that compliance in place, and then reducing the risk of not having that information if there's some reason you are audited, or there is some sort of a legal hold or litigation that takes place against your organization. And then, as well as allowing then, because you have that information retained, you have your policies in place for retention, being able to be more agile and effective in how you're able to share that knowledge and share that information, and ensure that users are working only with the content that's current and relevant to them. So you're also controlling and providing management around the principles of least privilege, and the ability to have individuals that don't have the rights to delete information, not delete information. And what are some of the approaches then to that? So we'll talk more, and we'll show you in this discussion how these all work together and how they're created within Microsoft 365. But it all starts with the retention label, and the retention label identifies what users can provide updates to an item, how that applies to, and if an update does take place, how that is handled within the content and the metadata within the document, as well as whether that user is able to make any changes to that document as well. And so you're setting up the essentially a policy in that label of how that information is going to be handled, and what needs to take place with that label. Very similar to the diagrams that Liam was saying, and in where it's going to go. When it's modified, when it's deleted, how long is it going to be retained, and then what's going to happen to it after it breaches that retention time period. Then we have our record label, which is a little bit different, where here only administrators have the ability to change or remove the label. So there's a little bit more control from an administrative standpoint. You're still identifying the users that can update any of the items or can apply the particular label. The administrators, though, are the only ones that can make those changes. And within a records label, the metadata is also not changeable. And if it's applied to a list item, if it is applied to a file, the content itself is made non-changeable. So it puts a little bit more of a hold in terms of governance on that document and changes that are on that document, so that people can't go in and make adjustments to that document. If there is something that might be incriminating on that document, it is maintained and nobody can make changes to it. And then we have our regulatory records labels, which again, users can update an item and apply that to the label, but nobody can change or remove those labels. So it's a lot more stringent from that standpoint, because it's regulatory. If it's regulated documentation, that then it needs to maintain its integrity throughout its life cycle. So we don't want to be making changes to it. We want to have version control to it, and we want to make sure that that nothing is altered in it, because this is something that might come up in terms of an audit or regulatory, legal disagreement or something like that. That you're not going to, that we can't have that incriminate us from a standpoint of an organization. And Liam, why don't you talk about the retention settings?
Yeah, so retention settings can be configured to help us achieve all of our goals that we have for, you know, keeping content for a certain amount of time, or whether we're going to be deleting content. So the first thing that we're trying to do is to retain content. So the idea is that we're retaining it so somebody can't delete the content, because we may need that for a specific amount of time. So of course, Dwayne mentioned tax records and Sarbanes-Oxley and other things like financial records, that unfortunately we do have these legal requirements to store that content. So what we want to do is make sure that we can keep it in a format that is still usable if needed, and make it so it is retained for that specific amount of time only. And then of course our second setting is obviously to delete the content permanently. And we touched on this a little bit ago, but it's really, really important. I mean, if you're like me, so I used to live in the UK and I worked for a global consulting firm. And when I left, I felt like I had to copy everything I'd ever done onto these DVD drives. And I had like 20 of them. Every single document I'd ever written, every single script I'd ever written, every piece of code. And I was like, I'm going to need these again. So I've lived in the US now for almost 11 years, and I've never used them. I've never opened them. I've never looked at them. I clearly didn't need to retain them for 11 years, and I had great pleasure in shredding them quite recently. But we're all the same. So it's important. Retention is quite a hard thing to do, because we inherently want to kind of keep everything and never delete it. But to be successful in retention, we retain as required and delete permanently, because there's nothing worse than, for example, having a litigation take place, and then all those files that you should have got rid of now become part of that litigation. So I suppose the question would be, is what kind of retention options do we have then within Microsoft 365? As a side note, one thing that Dwayne talked about was obviously the different type of approaches. So the labels, records labels, and the regulatory records labels. Now, of course, what's interesting is we originally only had two types of labels. We had retention and records. And then more recently was introduced the regulatory records label, because of course, those different use cases that we need to have. Now, of course, with those two types of retention actions, retaining and deletion, we can configure specific outcomes that would match those two scenarios and match whether it's a retention label, a records label, or a regulatory compliance label. So the first option we have is retain only. This will retain the content forever or for a specific amount of time. And that's a simple option. We go in and say retain forever. The next option is delete only. So this will just delete the content after a specified period. It's not really a retention. We're just saying just delete it, maybe 6 months after the last date it was changed, just delete it. And then of course our most common one is to retain and then delete. This is the most common one and the one that takes a little bit more time to implement. So when we do the retaining and delete, we are following a prescribed process. So we say, this is the content that I created and we've done work on it. It's reached a specific point where it becomes final. At that point, we then want to retain that as just retaining it in its current format, or we declare it as a record. But at that point, we determine that, and then we keep it, and then we delete it. These retention settings work with content in place and saves you the additional overhead of creating and configuring additional storage. So historically, in things like SharePoint Online or even SharePoint on premises or other applications, you had to have a designated storage place to move that content to. So you would say, I declare this as a record to retain, now move it somewhere else. Now we don't need to worry about that because it just does it in place, and wherever this content gets moved to, those retention policies will follow. Now, in addition, you don't need to implement any customized processes for copying or even synchronizing the data anywhere else. So what does it take to implement retention then? So understanding how retention works in Microsoft 365 is step number one. It might sound silly that that's the step number one, but truly that is the first step, understanding how it functions. I've sat in lots of meetings where we talk about retention, And then I explain kind of the logical process of how retention works. And then the most complicated conversation is what that looks like in the various applications. So what does it look like in SharePoint? What does it look like in OneDrive? What does it look like in Teams? And what does that mean when I declare something as a record? What actually happens? So our next step is to identify a key thing as to whether we need to use retention policies or retention labels or a combination. And we need to learn about retention and the differences between the two. Once we've understood what we want to do, we need to identify any of the settings and actions that are required by the organization or industry regulations. So you can see where we're going here. Understand how it works, then determine which approach you want to take, then go back and say, hey, to the legal team, the HR team, the finance team, what are your industry regulations and what are the policies that we need to adhere to? As part of that assessment, when you're speaking to them, you will determine whether you will use records management or not, because we can create retention labels and policies without using records management, or we can use records management in conjunction with that, and we'll talk about that shortly. So we then create retention policies and labels based on the settings and actions that were defined during that process. You know, for example, are we going to encrypt content? Do we need to, you know, save it for X number of years and then do this and then do a disposition review? Or do we just delete the content? You know, are we sending a message back to the owner and saying, hey, this content's being deleted. What do you want to do about it? Now, for retention labels, you might find it useful to use a file plan to define and refine the retention labels in a spreadsheet. So it's a great feature that Microsoft added where you can say, I've got a spreadsheet, this is what I want to create, and we import the spreadsheet and it builds a file plan. Now, if you're new to records management and retention, a file plan might seem a little bit overwhelming, but understand it to be, it's your list of policies and the definitions of those policies. That's really all it comes down to. And then, of course, our last step is to publish and apply those retention labels. So while retention policies are designed to be set it and forget it configuration, retention labels are the reusable building blocks that you can use within multiple policies. So it's not a one-to-one match. You don't say, this is my label, that's my policy. Even though that's what you might do, you may create 10 labels and then distribute them between 3 policies, depending on how you want to do that. And then as the labels get applied, the policies get applied, and we'll kind of walk through that flow so you can kind of see how that works. Now, what's the difference between the using records management or not using records management? So retention labels can be used with either. So from the no records management, what this means is that the retention labels will appear in your applications. So you'll see them in Outlook, SharePoint, OneDrive, etc. They'll actually show up as a label that you can apply. Labels can then also be applied to emails or documents. You can do it manually as a user or automatically. And I think I mentioned this before, if it's automatic something in Microsoft 365, the odds are pretty high it's going to be the E5 licensing, just because automatic tends to come at a bit of an extra cost. Content is retained based on the settings within the label that you apply. And there's no importing of labels or policies. It just kind of, you assign them, you let people assign them to the content, and it just works. And that's the standard no records management model. Now, if you determine that you want to use records management, then you get that, and you also get advanced analytics and insights to be able to automate retention schedules. So it means that we're going to keep track on content that's been associated, what it looked like, and how long it lasted for. We can also then use that Excel template like we talked about previously to import and build a file plan. We can then start to do what we can do in things like taxonomy, where we can define stakeholders who own those retention labels and the strategy that we've adopted. So we can say, these are my stakeholders. And so when changes need to be made or tweaks, we can go to the stakeholders. And then, of course, we can upload a completed plan and have it auto publish and auto apply all of the labels if we need to. So the records management option, though more complicated and obviously fundamentally is a little bit different to retention, it gives us some greater capabilities. But I would kind of encourage you to kind of start with no records management and work your way through, get individuals used to using it, and then determine that you need records management later. So let's say that we go through and build all of these labels and policies, etc. When do we start seeing them? Because I'm sure by now you know that Microsoft 365 isn't always instantaneous when things show up. You can see this, for example, in Microsoft Teams today, where even things like the person's status doesn't always show up as it should be. And that's because obviously it's a large scale cloud platform, and there are certain things that Microsoft do to make it meet the SLAs and continue to run. And so when we publish labels, if we publish a retention label, then what happens is after we've published it, there's a synchronization process that actually runs. So for example, if we're publishing it to SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, then it can be there within a day. But actually, Microsoft have actually said allow up to 7 days. Now that's a big range. It's either between a day or 7 days. So it could be somewhere in between. Hopefully it's a day, but just be aware it could take longer. So there's no point logging support tickets and saying it hasn't showed up in 3 days, because officially they say up to 7. Then of course, if we publish labels to Exchange, it's gonna probably take 7 days. And the mailboxes that it goes into need to have at least 10 megs worth of data in order for that to be visible. So at least for most end users, that will be okay. But the key is here that though it may show up or start to show up, if you're planning this, you'll need to make sure that you allow time for the policies and the labels to be published in order for it to be successful. Otherwise, your end users are not actually going to be able to utilize them, and it becomes really, really complicated at that point. Okay.
So Liam, yeah, we want to take a look at showing how you create the retention policies then?
Yes, indeed. Okay, so let me just share and screen 3, and then I think you need to stop sharing. So let me try it again. There we go. Okay, perfect. So I'm logged into my Microsoft 365 Compliance Center, which is where we're going to do the configuration. Remember, we've talked about this in the past, that if I go back to the main admin center, we get security and compliance. And sometimes this goes to new, sometimes it goes to old. If you end up in the old, you can easily just type compliance.microsoft.com and it will take you to where you're supposed to go. So what we're going to do is scroll right to the bottom, and we're going to click the show all link, because Microsoft likes to hide everything away from you. So we'll click show all, and then we'll actually just scroll down to this bottom section. Now you can see from here, we have records management as an option. We also have information governance as an action as well. So I'm going to click information governance, and this will take us to the ability to create retention labels. Now you can see by default, I do have some in here. You can see the duration of them and when they were last modified and what they stand for. If I go to label policies, then what we'll see is I only actually have 2 policies. So remember how we talked about that you can have multiple labels and then multiple policies, and they don't actually have to match one-to-one. We can also use the import option here as well, which I can move PST files and mail around as part of that information governance. But really what I'm interested in is the retention option too. Now, interestingly, notice the names here. So employee records, personal finance. Notice this one, PII retention policy. I'm going to go back to labels here, and you'll see that I've got PII retention policy. So I'm showing you that because it can be a little bit confusing when you come in, because you can create labels and label policies. But if you click on retention, you can then create retention policies. But retention policies are the same as the labels and the policies. So it can be a little bit confusing. So just so you know, you are kind of creating the same things, except the wizard interface is a little bit different. So what we'll do is we'll use retention, and I'll say new retention policy. Now, the first thing we'll do is call it, I'm going to call it a name, I'll call it demo retention, and I'll give it a friendly description of the same. Choose next. And then what we can do is apply the information to it. So I can say, I want to retain the content for a specific amount of time. So I can say restore that content, retain it forever, which I'm going to counsel you against doing unless you have a very specific need for that. So we'll say for this long, and we can say 7 years. So let's say we're using finance records, and then retain the content based on what? So when it was created or when it was last modified. That's a personal choice for you in the organization. I'm going to say when it was last modified. And then it says, do you want us to delete it after this time? Well, of course I do, because I don't want to keep the content forever. Or I could just remove the retain and just say, you know what, however long the content's been there, let's just delete it anyway after amount of time. So remember those 3 options we talked about, retain only, delete, or retain and delete? That's these 3 options right here. We also then have a question for you. Do you need more options? Of course I do. I'm going to say use advanced. And then from here, I can then start to filter the content that's going to come under that retention. So we spoke last time about sensitive info, and we talked about sensitive information types that we can use for creating sensitivity labels that we classify. We can utilize that same thing. So I'm going to use this one, and we'll say, you know what, I'm just going to detect the content using sensitive info. And then you'll notice it takes me to that same screen that we use for data loss prevention and sensitive information. But I'm going to go back. I'm not going to use those. I'm just going to say yes, 7 years when it was last modified, and delete. Choose next. And now I get to specify the locations that I want to use for this. So Exchange, SharePoint, OneDrive, and Office 365 groups are default. And then you'll see we have public folders, team channels, and chat messages are obviously optional. In fact, they're all optional. So I'm going to uncheck, uncheck, and uncheck. I'm going to say SharePoint only. Choose next. Now notice it will tell you here it will take up to 1 day. We know that could take 7. They don't really put the 7 on there, but the documentation does say up to 7 days. And then I'm going to click here and say create the policy. So this goes ahead and creates a retention policy using the new retention option. And what should happen is you'll see my demo retention policy is here. Now, what does that look like over here? Well, if I go into labels and refresh a little bit, we can keep going. Notice there's nothing that shows up as demo. Keep refreshing. Nothing shows up yet because remember the time it takes between refreshes. If I go to label policies here, wait for that to refresh also, still I've got my medical records retention, and you'll notice that it doesn't seem to sync between the 2 of them. So what does that mean? Well, what are these labels? Well, if I click create label here, notice I'm going to call it demo label, and we'll put a message for the admin and the users. Choose next. I say retention. Notice it looks very similar to what we created before, which was a retention policy using retention policy. But this time I get some other options. So I'm going to keep it for 7 years again. I can then delete the content automatically, which is the same as the last one. I can then trigger a disposition review, which will say, hey, Dwayne, I want you to review this before we do anything. Or I can just say nothing, leave it as there forever. So I'm going to say delete automatically again, and I'll choose next. I can actually go into here and notice first before we go ahead, we can say, well, actually, I want to filter it down. So I'm going to say last modified again. So choose next and create the label. So doesn't that seem a little bit weird that we're creating a demo label that has retention on it when we created a retention policy that has it on? And then if I go to retention, that label doesn't show up because these are policies. But if I go to my label now and see I've got my demo label, I can then choose publish a label. It's going to show me the details about that. Choose next. I'm going to say apply to everybody. I'm going to call this one demo policy. Choose next and publish labels. So 2 different ways of creating what effectively is going to be a retention policy. If I now go into label policies, we should now see demo policy. In retention, I've still got my retention, but notice what happened. Do you see how confusing that is? Now my demo policy has showed up, but my demo retention one doesn't. So 2 different ways of creating the same thing. Now, if we go 1 step further and click records management and go into here, I'm going to wait for this to load, but you'll see we have file plan and label policies. If I click file plan, you can see that my demo label shows up here, because the label is the one that has the policies. If I click label policies, you'll see my demo policy shows up. So I'm showing you this because it can be quite confusing of where you would go to create. So in reality, if you're creating labels based on records management, you go into the records management container and create it there. Even though it flows and appears in information governance, you always create it in records management. If you're not using records management and you wish to create either generic retention policies or you want to create multiple labels and then policies, you can use information governance. If you're creating just basic retention, then make sure you use the retention option. If you're creating labels that can be utilized in multiple places, then create the label and label policies. So I hope that helps in kind of explaining where it all kind of goes. It's not the easiest, and Microsoft have not made it easy for you to figure out which place to create. And I'm sure, Dwayne, you've never seen that before, anything like that, where it's all in the same place, multiple places.
Where Microsoft makes it simple? No.
No, that's right.
So out of the ordinary.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing.
Yep.
And then why don't you walk us through how you can monitor some of these things?
That sounds good. So yeah, how does this monitoring work within these labels now that we've gone through and done a good job of confusing where these retention labels and got records management and everything goes in there. Now you got to monitor and manage it, right? So how are we going to do that? So there's different places now that where when you create those labels and those label policies, where these can be monitored within your environment. The first of which is is label activity for documents and viewing those activities of the file and folders. So once you've created your labels, now you want to verify that that content has now been given that retention label that has been that you intended it to have. So with the Label Activity Explorer in the Compliance Center for Office 365, you can search and view the label activity and all the content across all of your documents within SharePoint or OneDrive and OneDrive for Business over the past 30 days. And this provides you with that real-time data that gives you that clear view of what's happening within your tenant and with those policies that you have in place. So very important from that standpoint to understand what's going on there. And then there's also being able to utilize the label analytics for the retention labels and those sensitivity labels. You'll want to see how they're being used across your tenant. And we talked about sensitivity labels in our talk earlier in the week. That these labels and what we want to do with these labels and how they're being utilized, who's accessing them, and again, this can also be accessed in the Microsoft 365 compliance centers and security centers to quickly see which labels are being used the most and where those are being applied, and then finally through your data governance reports. So if you created your label, you want to verify that they're being applied to the content as intended, and you want to make sure have a report that you can pull to verify that and to potentially present that to your governing board or your C-level people in your organization. You can generate that report also from the Security and Compliance Center. So there's 3 different areas within the Security and Compliance Center that you can ultimately go to and understand what's going on with your data. And so just to take the label analytics reports a step further and what is available to view within them, you have the ability to look at what the total number of retention labels and sensitivity labels are being applied to the content, gives you a top-down account of the labels and how many times each label was applied to the documentation within there, the locations within your environment where the labels are applied and the count for each of the location, or also the count for how many files and folders had their retention labels changed or removed. So from a compliance standpoint, you can see if any users have made modifications to those labels for that documentation and in those files and folders, and then maybe to investigate why that has happened, and make sure that you are not out of compliance in some area because somebody has done some sort of modification. And then take the data governance reports a step further and understand what those are. They provide reports for the top 5 labels. So a report of what's being applied to your content and what those top 5 labels are that are being used to help you understand, what the organization is utilizing, what kind of information we have within our organization, and maybe find labels that might not be necessary within your organization anymore. Viewing, what has been recently applied. So you may have top 5 labels, but maybe one of those labels hasn't been applied for a few years. So we're still managing maybe that content and the retention of that content, but it may not pertain to the types of documents that your organization is utilizing currently. And then you have then also to look at whether the documents are manually or auto applied those labels, so that you can find what percentage of that content then is being done by users applying those labels, or that's automatically applied to those labels, and understand maybe if we're seeing a label that is being applied a lot from a manual standpoint, maybe that label and those types of documents need to have that label auto applied, and it takes out the guesswork of the users within the organization that are applying those labels. It shows the records tagging, and that report will show the content that's been tagged as a record or a non-record, and then the percentage of that content that's been tagged as a record or non-record as well. And then finally, the last report is those label trends over the past 90 days. Again, similar to like the top 5 labels, it helps to understand the count and the location of those labels within the past 3 months, and how those labels are being used, and helps you from a management standpoint in your data governance of what adjustments may need to be made in terms of your labels, what labels maybe could be retired, and what labels all of this can help you to build a governance plan around how your labels are being used, so that you don't have just dozens and dozens of labels that might not pertain to the types of documents that you're working in within your organization. So Liam, do you want to show everybody how this works from that standpoint?
I can do, yeah. Okay, let me just share again. Oops, one more. Okay, so back in the admin center this time, because what I want to show you is kind of the tree of options that are available to you to be able to get to places. So first off, in the native admin center, there is a generic report section that's available on the left-hand side. So we've not gone to security or compliance. I can click into security and compliance as a link. And what's nice now is we now get the nice green bar. So I wanted to show you that because it's been a long time coming that we've not been able to do this. So I can now click and say reports dashboard, which will take me to, weirdly, the old security and compliance center, not even the new one. But it's good though, because what it does, it starts to add the kind of the reports. So a couple of the reports that Dwayne had mentioned, obviously top labels and trending. And then of course you can see there's lots of other ones that get rendered here too. So we have information about that, but this report link doesn't give you the specifics that you're looking for. It's just a generic view. We can actually go down to information governance on the left-hand side, which is kind of what we used in the new one. And we can click into the dashboard here. And of course, it gives you the nice bright yellow message that says, hey, there's a new one. And then underneath it, we get some of these little widget things which are available that will allow me to click into, and you can see we've got manually and auto applied. Now, of course, I'm just using a generic tenant here. But you can see we have some basic information around retention, what's been retained. 27 users are currently covered by this retention. So it's meant to be a quick view and go, hey, look at the dashboard. Doesn't that look great? That's really what that's about. Now on the left-hand side, we also get Label Activity Explorer, which is a little bit more detailed. So what we have here is the ability to filter through the data based on activities. So I can say, well, I would like to see label changes or label activities based on specific dates and times. So I could say label activities, and then of course I get to choose the label or file name or manual or workload, etc. And then I get the dates. And as before, notice there's a bunch of dates grayed out and a bunch that are not. The bunch that are not are the dates that we can actually go back to, and that fulfills our range of information. And then of course we can refresh and then try to load data if there's any there. Once that's done, this is what's powerful. I can find out who applied the label or what the workload would actually be. Now it's a bit weird because we're in like the old kind of version of this. So I'm going to change and go back to the Compliance Center, and I'm going to encourage you that you go here instead of the other locations, because this is the one where the investments are being made. So firstly, we can click on reports, and you'll see as we scroll down, we've got, for example, 29 items that have retention applied to them, and we get kind of this view that we can click on. So I can click and filter the data that's directly here, and I can rotate through the different types. It's a really weird interface just because it's so small, but you can scroll up and down and then look where the labels would be. So you can see I've got SharePoint Online has 6 and OneDrive has 23. I can then click Show More. This will then take me to here and shows me the actual labels that have been created. So it doesn't give me the report, it just shows me the labels that are applied. Now, of course, this just gives you generic retention labels, so the top labels that have been applied. We also have what's called the Explore Label Activity, which you'll notice still bounces me back to the old one. So even though you might start with the compliance one, you will end up ultimately going back into there. But while we're here, if we've created what we talked about last time, which was sensitivity labels and DLP labels and retention policies, they will all show listed here. Now that's great, but what about if I'm looking for something quite specific? So the good news is we can use something we talked about previously. We can use the audit log to be able to identify labels. Now, when we go into here and choose the drop down, if I type label, what you'll see is Microsoft is automatically capturing these type of activities. So someone changed retention for mailboxes, retention and policy retention labels. You'll see everything that you would ever kind of want to know, or at least identify, as that is included in the reports, but this gives you the more granular breakdown, is available as an option here. We can also go and see other types of labels. So remember we talked about the lifespan of a document. So when you're doing these reports, you may be actually looking for, have I applied a sensitivity label, and then what's the retention that was applied to it. But if I go back into retention and say create retention label, create policy, and just use those two, I can then go to my dates, and remember the grayed out, oh, I need to go the one before that. And then that gives me today. So I can click search. And what this will do is go ahead and look for any actions where somebody created, and it didn't pick up my today one, but it would have picked up the one we just created, and it should list that. So it will then give me the list of retention policies and labels. We can also look at the deleted ones. We can also look at any updated ones. We could also look at any that had regulatory record options applied to them. So this is one way of actually going through and seeing the raw data. Now, this information is also stored in various other locations too. So we can actually go into records management on the left-hand side here, and we get to see pending dispositions and the label application activity. We can also then manage the file plan directly from here. And when we go into the file plan and label policies, there's no way of getting reports from this. When you click on them, it doesn't show you anything. So to render the reports, you're going to utilize the old kind of label activity process, the dashboard for information governance, the new one that's listed here in information governance in the report section at the top, and obviously click through the items. But for me, I always go back to, I would like a list of activities. I want to know exactly who applied, who didn't apply. then I can do things with that information. I've actually seen organizations take the data from here and then flow that data into Power BI, because the reports keep changing so constantly inside the tenant until Microsoft have kind of standardized what they would be. Then we can take the raw data, because remember, once it's here, we can export the data, import it into Power BI, and then once it's there, we can then perform cross queries against it and create nice charts and data. So those are kind of the core places that you would go to be able to identify what's been going on with label policies, retention policies, and then of course, as Microsoft continue to update and add the right widgets to the right pages, then we'll be able to see them in a consistent place. It's not that they're not there, they're just kind of a little bit all over the place. Okay, so let me stop sharing.
All right. So that brings us to the end of this talk. Hopefully everybody feels they've learned something around information governance, how retention policies work, how we can utilize that for our records management and retention for complying to our legal requirements, our regulatory compliance, or just our organizational policies. And then again, how we monitor that information governance, how we monitor, manage, protect the organization around utilizing retention labels, utilizing the data protection and sensitivity labels that we talked about in our last talk. All of those things all work together in terms of the security and compliance of our organization and how all that works as a full ecosystem within the Microsoft 365 environment. So I want to thank everybody for listening to this CloudMaker expert talk on retention policies and information governance in Microsoft 365. My name is Dwayne Natwick.
And my name's Liam Cleary.
And if you want to catch up on any of these talks, you can certainly go to skillmeup.com, and all of these talks are available there. Both mine and Liam's talks and talks I've done on my own with other MVPs and Microsoft people as well as other individuals within the Skill Me Up organization that have done many different talks and episodes around the CloudMaker, Thinking Cloudy, and Cloud Native channels, as well as if you subscribe to the Skill Me Up YouTube channel. These episodes also are making their way on the YouTube channel a couple weeks after we have aired them on the Skill Me Up channel. But if you go to skillmeup.com, there is also a series of upcoming events that you can join live, and hope to see you in a future episode. Thank you very much.